In the remote silence of upstate New York, where the forest breathes like a living creature and the fog drapes itself across the valleys like morning silk, a discovery was made that should have never come to light. The locals had long whispered that the woods were cursed not in the way of fairy tales or childish superstition, but in a tone that trembled with memory. They spoke of the Hollow Creek settlement, a community erased from maps and forgotten by time, and of the ground that refused to grow anything but moss and rot. It began, as most horrors do, by accident. In the summer of 1978, a construction crew was hired to clear a remote section of land outside the town of Castor Hollow to make way for a highway extension. The men were hardened, sunburned, and used to the oddities of nature, but not to what they found that morning. Beneath a layer of rock and root, the bulldozer struck something that did not sound like earth. When they unearthed it, what came up was not a stone, but a small wooden cross bound in wire and buried upside down. The site foreman, a man named Robert Kessler, brushed the dirt away and unearthed a series of carved symbols burned into the wood spirals and Latin letters forming a phrase no one could translate. The digging continued, cautiously now, until one of the men uncovered the first skull. The bones were stacked, not laid to rest, but piled as if stored, dozens of them. Some were children's. The site was immediately sealed, and within hours the sheriff's department arrived. What followed was a discovery that would shake the quiet town to its spiritual core. A mass grave containing the remains of over 72 people, all bearing marks of ritual disfigurement. The story might have ended there, sealed under the cold language of a police report. But one detail refused to rest. Beneath the graves, deeper still, a chamber was found, stone walls, candle mounts, and a rusted iron door engraved with the words Domus Spiritus Purissimi, the house of the pure spirit. When state investigators opened that chamber, the air that rushed out was foul enough to make men vomit. The walls were carved with verses, both biblical and heretical, scratched by hand as if by someone desperate to record what they had seen before death came. Among those scribbles was a single date, October 13, 1834. It took historians months to trace the name carved repeatedly into the walls, Ravencroft. The Ravencraft brothers, Ezekiel and Nathaniel, had founded a small separatist sect in the early 19th century known to the public as the Congregation of the Pure Spirit. To outsiders, they were missionaries, devout, austere, obsessed with purification. To those within, they were gods in human form. Records from nearby counties told of disappearances, of families who left their farms to join the settlement, and were never seen again. But the deeper the researchers dug, the more the official record blurred. Government census data listed Hollow Creek as abandoned by 1,841, its population relocated due to plague. Yet no medical records existed, no graves were marked. Local legends filled the void where history failed. Children were told not to wander north of the river at dusk, lest they hear the whispering hymns, low voices chanting prayers no church ever claimed. Fishermen swore they saw pale figures kneeling by the river's edge in the dead of night, as if baptizing shadows. For decades the area was avoided. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to enter the woods. Travelers who camped nearby spoke of bells ringing under the soil. By the time the bones were uncovered in 1978, most residents believed the stories were just folklore until they saw the photographs. The newspapers released them reluctantly, skeletons with twisted limbs, mouths bound with rope, and crude symbols burned into bone. On one skull, etched deeply across the forehead, were 3 Latin words, corpus in spiritum, the body into spirit. The media frenzy lasted weeks, but official statements were scarce. The state sealed the excavation site, citing biohazard concerns, and the artifacts were transported to an undisclosed facility. Unofficially, several members of the forensic team resigned after that first night in the chamber. One of them, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Hayes, later wrote in her private notes leaked years later that she had seen something written in human blood on the ceiling, words that appeared and faded as the light shifted. She was found dead in her apartment 3 months later, suicide, they said. Yet the true story, the origin of the congregation, was not buried with the bones. It lived on in diaries, letters, and fragments of sermons collected by a single man, Professor Daniel Whitlock, a historian from Cornell who dedicated his career to uncovering the truth behind Hollow Creek. Whitlock would later call it the single most complete account of madness disguised as faith. According to Whitlock's research, the Ravencroft brothers had arrived in upstate New York in 1824, claiming divine visions. Ezekiel, the elder, was a failed seminarian excommunicated from the Church of St. Agatha for unauthorized doctrine and sacrilegious practice. Nathaniel, the younger, was said to be a physician, though no medical license was ever found. Together, they preached a message that blended scripture with science, insisting that the soul could be purified through the transmutation of flesh. By 1829, they had gathered over 100 followers' families, widows, even clergymen, and built a settlement in the woods known as Hollow Creek. There, they constructed a chapel, a communal hall, and a network of underground chambers for spiritual meditation. The people of Castor Hollow said the brothers believed the earth itself was a living body and that by burying themselves within it, they could commune directly with God. When the outside world stopped hearing from them after 1834, no one dared to investigate. A harsh winter was blamed for their disappearance. But now, with the graves unearthed, a darker theory emerged that the congregation had not perished by plague, but by doctrine. That the Ravencrofts had led their followers to self-sacrifice, promising resurrection through suffering. Even after the case was officially closed, whispers continued that something had been left behind in those tunnels, something not entirely human. The locals claimed they still saw pale lights moving between the trees on moonless nights, and heard a voice, slow, hollow, and pleading, calling from beneath the soil. Whether or not those stories are true is irrelevant. The fact remains that in the dense forests of upstate New York, a piece of American history was born and buried, a reminder that not all faith heals, and not all prayers are heard by heaven. Faith has always been mankind's most delicate madness. In every century, in every nation, there has existed some soul who claimed to hear the voice of God more clearly than the rest and more dangerously, convinced others to listen. For Hollow Creek, that voice belonged to Ezekiel Ravencroft. He arrived in New York during the last breath of winter, 1824. The Erie Canal was being built, the frontier was alive with promise, and the villages along the Hudson were swelling with settlers chasing divine and earthly fortunes alike. But Ezekiel did not come seeking fortune. He came claiming revelation. A man of 34, gaunt yet arresting. His eyes were described by one witness as pale as ash, but bright with fever. He wore a black coat even in summer and carried a leather-bound Bible, one he had altered by hand, replacing certain verses with his own interpretations. Those who met him said he spoke with a calm that silenced every room, as if every word were weighed in eternity before spoken aloud. Ezekiel's first sermons took place not in churches, but in barns and river clearings. He spoke of purity, not moral purity as preached from pulpits, but spiritual anatomy. He claimed that sin had physical weight, that it embedded itself in the body, and that salvation could be achieved only by extracting it through pain and isolation. When questioned by local clergy, he would smile and quote scripture backward, claiming, "God's truth is not always meant to be read from left to right." It was madness, yet there was a strange order to it, a rhythm that mesmerized. People who came to mock him left shaken, uncertain of what they had heard. By the end of that summer, a small circle began to form around him, the lost, the grieving, and the disillusioned. Among them was his younger brother Nathaniel Ravencroft, recently returned from the Caribbean, where he had served as a field physician. Nathaniel was different. Where Ezekiel was the prophet, Nathaniel was the scientist. His fascination with life and death bordered on obsession. In letters recovered from his private correspondence, he wrote of the soul as a measurable energy and the blood as its vessel. He claimed that by refining the body, one could filter the soul of its corruption. Together, the brothers formed a doctrine that blended Ezekiel's theology with Nathaniel's anatomy, a gospel of flesh and fire. They called it the doctrine of transmutation. Its promise was simple and terrible, that through suffering one could be reborn pure, closer to God. By 1827, word of the Ravencrofts' new congregation had spread across 3 counties. Farmers, widows, and even a few learned men traveled north to hear the brothers preach. What they found was not a chapel but a clearing in the woods, where Ezekiel would speak beneath an enormous oak tree, its roots half-exposed like the veins of the earth. The sermons lasted hours, often at twilight, and the air would fill with chanting, low, rhythmic, hypnotic. Witnesses later described the sound as a hum that entered the bones. The brothers soon purchased a tract of land deep within the wilderness Hollow Creek, 30 miles from the nearest town. There, they began building what they called the settlement of the pure spirit. Their followers cleared trees, raised wooden cabins, and dug wells by hand. They prayed 3 times a day, worked without rest, and surrendered all property to the congregation. Every evening, Ezekiel would walk through the settlement carrying a lantern and whisper prayers into each doorway. Nathaniel oversaw medical purifications, bloodletting, fasting, and herbal tonics meant to cleanse the soul. At first, these rituals seemed harmless, even pious. But as months turned to years, the practices grew darker. According to a surviving diary by a follower named Miriam Calvert, the brothers introduced something they called the Night of Rebirth. Once every full moon, the congregation would gather in the underground chamber beneath the chapel. There, they would kneel in silence as Ezekiel read from his altered scripture. Nathaniel would then produce a small iron instrument, part scalpel, part crucifix, and trace it across the foreheads of the chosen few, drawing a drop of blood to symbolize the release of the flesh. Those who screamed were told their faith was weak. Those who endured in silence were declared closer to God. By 1829, Hollow Creek was completely isolated. The paths leading to it were covered in brush, and anyone who came uninvited was turned away at gunpoint. But for those inside, the world outside no longer existed. The congregation called Ezekiel Father and Nathaniel the Healer. Marriages were arranged by divine instruction. Children were baptized not with water, but with ashes. And in the center of the chapel hung a wooden effigy of a man without eyes, the pure spirit himself, said to represent what humanity would become once freed from the burden of flesh. Local authorities received reports of missing persons, but investigations led nowhere. The Ravencrofts were careful. They sent letters to relatives claiming their followers had departed for missionary work or joined a religious commune in Canada. For nearly 5 years, Hollow Creek thrived in secrecy, its name uttered only in whispers by nearby townsfolk. Then came the visions. Miriam Calvert's final entries spoke of voices rising from the ground at night, and of Ezekiel claiming to see angels with faces made of mirrors. He began insisting that the forest was sacred because it was alive, that beneath its roots dwelled the spirit itself, sleeping, waiting to awaken through the suffering of the faithful. Nathaniel, meanwhile, expanded his experiments. He believed he could measure the soul's departure by recording the change in body temperature at the moment of death. To test this, he began with animals. Then, with permission of the congregation, he moved on to the willing. When a child died of fever, Ezekiel declared it a sign the spirit's hunger for innocence. From that point on, the rituals became sacrifices. The faithful were told that by offering their flesh, they would ascend. The walls of the chapel were soon marked with symbol circles enclosing triangles, lines intersecting like veins. Each represented a transmutation, a soul purified. By the summer of 1832, over 100 souls called Hollow Creek their home. None would ever leave. It is easy from the comfort of distance to label them as mad. But madness has its own gravity, and faith, when twisted, can hold entire worlds together. The congregation of the pure spirit was not born of evil men, but of men who mistook obsession for holiness. They believed the forest spoke, and they listened. And if you stand in that clearing today, when the wind is low and the fog curls between the trees, some say you can still hear the echoes of their chants, a soft, trembling murmur beneath the leaves. A prayer, perhaps, for forgiveness, or a warning to those who still believe that purity can ever be born from blood. By the year 1833, the woods around Hollow Creek had grown unnaturally silent. The birds that once circled above the chapel were gone, the river ran murky and thick, and even the deer had vanished from the valley. The townsfolk of Castor Hollow said it was the curse of the congregation that the forest itself was suffocating under the weight of their prayers. But those who lived within the settlement did not call it a curse. They called it a sign of ascension. Ezekiel Ravencroft had changed. Gone was the calm preacher who spoke of light through suffering. In his place stood a gaunt, hollow-eyed prophet who claimed to have seen heaven open in the forest. His followers recorded his words faithfully in the Book of Transmutations, a handwritten scripture that historians would later call a map of divine delusion. In it, Ezekiel wrote that pain was the flame by which the soul is boiled clean, and that through agony, man could shed the mortal residue that binds him to the earth. To those outside, it would have sounded like madness, but to those inside Hollow Creek, Ezekiel's every word was truth. The sermons became longer, the fasts more severe. The people no longer ate bread or meat, only bitter herbs and water mixed with ashes. Sleep was forbidden for more than 4 hours. Every morning, the congregation gathered before dawn to kneel in the frost and chant the same prayer. Burn the flesh, lift the soul, release the light within. The rituals of purification evolved into something far darker. Nathaniel Ravencroft, still the physician of the settlement, began conducting what he called sacraments of extraction. These were private ceremonies held in the underground chambers, narrow tunnels lit by animal, fat candles, where the smell of blood mixed with incense. Nathaniel believed that sin lived in the nerves, in the very fibers of the body. To remove it, he devised crude instruments of iron and bone, a mixture of surgical precision and spiritual theater. Witnesses, those who survived, later described the ceremonies in whispers: the cutting of skin to let the darkness out, the mixing of blood with consecrated oil, the sealing of wounds with ash. The participants did not scream. They were taught that pain was the voice of God, and to cry out was to blaspheme. The floor of the chamber was said to be covered in symbols, drawn not in chalk, but in dried blood. In the center, a great wooden table served as both altar and operating slab. Each ritual ended the same way. The subject, trembling and pale, would be anointed with their own blood while Ezekiel intoned, "Now you are less than man and more than flesh. You are spirit made pure." But purity has always demanded a price. Over time, the congregation began to fracture. Hunger and exhaustion bred hallucinations. Mothers claimed to see their dead children walking through the trees. Men spoke of hearing whispers under their skin. Some tried to flee, but the forest never let them go. According to one recovered journal, a man named Joseph Calvert attempted to escape in late 1833. He was found 3 days later, hanging upside down from the oak near the chapel, his eyes and tongue removed. A note pinned to his chest read, "The body must not resist the soul." The Ravencrofts called it divine punishment. The people believed. The doctrine deepened. Ezekiel claimed that the spirit, the being he worshipped, had spoken directly to him during a fast lasting 9 days. "The world," he said, "is but the husk of a greater being, and through our pain we feed its awakening." He began referring to the spirit not as he or God, but as it, a force without form or mercy. The sermons turned apocalyptic. He prophesied that when enough pure souls had been transmuted, the forest itself would open, revealing a light that would consume the unworthy. Nathaniel, meanwhile, had descended into a private madness of his own. His journals from that period, later recovered by Professor Whitlock, describe in exacting detail his attempts to record the soul's passage. He constructed crude devices, copper coils, mercury vials, glass tubes, believing that he could capture the essence released at death. The walls of his laboratory were lined with jars of strange fluids, each labeled with a name and a date. "I have seen it," he wrote, "a shimmer in the air when the heart stops, like smoke escaping the lips." He began referring to these jars as vessels of salvation. To the faithful, they were proof that their suffering was not in vain, that the soul could indeed be harvested, purified, and stored until the final ascension. But to the few who still retained reason, it was an unspeakable horror. The breaking point came with what the Ravencrofts called the Great Offering. On the night of October 13th, 1834, the entire congregation was summoned to the underground chapel. The candles were lit, the hymns sung in reverse Latin, the air thick with the smell of burning tallow. Ezekiel declared that the time of transmutation had come, that they had purified themselves enough to enter the womb of the Spirit. Each member was given a small wooden token marked with the symbol of the circle and the cross. Those who hesitated were told that doubt was the final sin. The ritual began at midnight. The chamber echoed with chanting as Nathaniel administered a final cleansing draught, a mixture of opium, belladonna, and unknown herbs. Many collapsed where they stood, their bodies convulsing as Ezekiel continued to pray. Others knelt willingly, their lips moving in ecstasy as the air grew thin and heavy. Miriam Calvert's final entry, written in trembling script, reads, "He told us we would become light. I felt my body leaving me, the air turning thick as honey. Someone screamed, or maybe it was me. The walls were breathing. I saw Father kneel and lift his hands, and then the candles went out." What happened in the hours that followed remains one of history's most unsettling mysteries. When authorities finally discovered the site decades later, the remains suggested chaos bones piled haphazardly, skulls bearing signs of blunt trauma, ribs broken outward as if from internal force. Some bodies were arranged in a perfect circle around the altar, their hands clasped together. Others were found crawling toward the exit, frozen in positions of terror. Only a handful of the faithful survived that night, those too weak or too young to attend the ceremony. They would later wander into nearby towns days or weeks later, starving, delirious, and covered in ash. None could remember clearly what had happened. They spoke of a light beneath the ground, and voices made of wind. One survivor, an 8-year-old girl, reportedly told a priest he said we would become stars. After the Great Offering, Hollow Creek ceased to exist. The chapel burned to the ground, the tunnels collapsed, and the forest began reclaiming the land. When officials arrived months later, they found nothing but charred wood and soil, blackened as if by lightning. The Ravencroft brothers were never found. Some claimed they had perished with their followers. Others swore they saw two figures wandering north along the river at dawn, their faces veiled in ash. Yet even in their absence, the doctrine of suffering lived on. Copies of the Book of Transmutations began appearing in nearby towns, hand-copied by those who had escaped the congregation before the end. Each version contained slight variations, as if rewritten from memory, but all carried the same central creed. Through agony comes release, through release perfection, through perfection union. It would take decades before scholars fully understood how deep the doctrine's roots went. By the late 1800s, fragments of its language began to appear in other fringe sects across the Northeast: cults, Hermetic societies, even early spiritualist movements. The Ravencrofts had vanished, but their ideas had bled into the soil of faith itself. Pain, they believed, was not punishment, it was passage, and in the silent woods of Hollow Creek, the echoes of that passage remain. When the night is clear and the moon full, locals still claim to see faint lights flickering beneath the ground, as though something buried there has never truly died, only waited. Waiting, perhaps, for another believer to listen again. When the first investigators entered the ruins of Hollow Creek in the spring of 1835, the settlement looked as though the forest had swallowed it whole. The wooden chapel was a skeleton of charred beams, the cabins had collapsed into mounds of rot, and the earth itself felt strange underfoot, spongy, as if hollow. The men who came were not priests or historians, but surveyors hired by the state to assess the damage after reports of unexplained sinkholes. They did not expect to find death. The discovery began with a sound. One of the men, Henry Lockwood, later wrote that as he walked near the remains of the chapel, he heard something like a faint bell, not metallic, but distant, like a hum rising from beneath the ground. When he pressed his ear to the soil, he swore he could hear a voice. His crew laughed it off until one of their shovels struck stone. Under a layer of roots and ashes, they uncovered a slab, smooth, rectangular, engraved with the same sigil found on the bodies years later, a circle intersected by 3 lines. When they pried it open, the smell that escaped was enough to make the men retch. Beneath the slab lay a stairway descending into blackness. The steps were slick with moisture, the air heavy with decay. By lantern light they descended. What they found has never been fully explained. The main chamber was vast, 40 feet wide, its ceiling low and arched, the walls lined with sconces carved directly into the stone. Along one wall stood 7 alcoves, each containing what appeared to be an altar, though time and rot had eroded their purpose. Strange instruments lay scattered across the floor, rusted scalpels, metal hooks, fragments of glass, and bones too numerous to count. But the most disturbing feature was the writing. Every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floor was covered in inscriptions, carved with obsessive precision. Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and something else, something no scholar could later identify. Henry Lockwood's report, found decades later in a forgotten archive, describes it best. It was as if madness itself had taken the form of language. Every inch of stone was speaking, and though I could not read the words, I felt their meaning. Suffering, submission, rebirth. The air hummed with it. In the center of the chamber stood a massive wooden table, still intact, darkened by age and something far older than dust. Above it hung an iron ring suspended from the ceiling by chains, the kind used for binding livestock. Except here it was stained with what appeared to be blood. Beneath the table, the investigators found remnants of candles, strands of hair, and a child's shoe. Further in, they discovered a narrow passage leading deeper underground. The walls were wet with condensation, and the sound of dripping echoed endlessly. The passage opened into another room, smaller, circular, with 7 stone pillars arranged evenly around its edge. On each pillar was carved a single name, most of them too worn to read. Only 2 remained legible, Ezekiel and Nathaniel. In the center stood a sealed iron door, its surface engraved with the words Corpus in Spiritum, the same phrase later found carved into the skulls. Lockwood ordered the door opened, but when the men tried to force it, the hinges groaned like a dying animal. Inside was darkness so complete that even their lanterns seemed dim. Beyond that door lay a place the reports would call the lower chambers. They described it as a labyrinth of tunnels, narrow, twisting, filled with alcoves that looked like sleeping cells. Some contained skeletons curled in fetal positions, others, jars filled with thick, dark liquid. On one wall, someone had drawn a crude diagram of the human body, annotated with Latin words meaning vessel, light, and release. In one alcove, they found what appeared to be a crude machine, a metal frame, wires, and tubes connected to a human skull. Nathaniel's experiments had not been legend after all. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The air grew thick, oppressive, humming with a low vibration that none of the men could explain. Lockwood claimed it felt like standing inside a heartbeat. Several of the workers refused to continue. One man collapsed, muttering that he had seen faces in the dark, pale, eyeless, pressed against the stone as if trying to escape. At last, they reached the final chamber. It was perfectly circular, its walls smooth and black, reflecting the lantern light like water. In the center lay a pool not of water, but of something thicker, darker. The smell was metallic, nauseating. Floating within it were bones, hundreds of them, fused together as though melted. Above the pool, carved in letters 2 feet high, was a single sentence: "Here the flesh becomes the word." When they returned to the surface, the men sealed the entrance and swore never to speak of it again. Lockwood's report was buried in state archives, marked confidential, religious site, yet rumors leaked. The few who had entered the tunnels all suffered strange ailments in the weeks that followed: fevers, nightmares, hearing voices calling their names in the night. 2 were later institutionalized. One disappeared entirely. It was not until over a century later, in 1952, that Hollow Creek's buried chambers were rediscovered. This time by a group of amateur archaeologists from Syracuse University, led by a man named Dr. Alan Rourke. They had read fragments of the old reports and were fascinated by the mystery. Armed with modern equipment and academic arrogance, they descended into the forest, convinced they could uncover the truth behind the superstition. They found the same stairway, the same chambers, only now the writing was clearer, preserved by the cold earth. Rourke described it as a cathedral carved for madness, but it was his assistant, Lydia Graham, who made the most chilling discovery. Behind one of the sealed alcoves, she found a hidden compartment, a small iron chest wrapped in decayed cloth. Inside were the remnants of parchment pages, ink faded but legible. They appeared to be written by Nathaniel himself. The pages detailed his experiments in horrifying clarity: notes on body temperature, organ removal, and the attempt to trap the departing light. One passage read, "Ezekiel believes the spirit dwells below, but I have seen its reflection in the eye of the dying. It is not God. It is hunger made holy." Rourke published a partial paper the following year titled The Hollow Creek Phenomenon, but it was quickly withdrawn after funding was cut, and several of his team members began to experience psychological breakdowns. Lydia Graham, the assistant who found the journal, was institutionalized after claiming she heard voices whispering in Latin every time she closed her eyes. She hanged herself in her cell 3 months later. The tunnels were sealed again, this time by the state under historical preservation, though locals insist it was to keep something inside, and yet, every few decades, someone returns. Curious explorers, journalists, or occult enthusiasts drawn by the same siren call that lured the first believers. Most return shaken, some don't return at all. Those who do speak of lights faint, flickering like lanterns deep below the earth. They describe the sound of chanting, of dripping water that sometimes forms words. One explorer in the 1970s claimed he found a chamber lined with jars, each glowing faintly from within. He broke one open, and inside found nothing but ash, yet the glow clung to his hands for hours afterward. He burned them badly trying to wash it off. Today, the entrance to Hollow Creek is hidden behind state fencing and warning signs. No trespassing. Contaminated site. But contamination, as Professor Whitlock once said, is not always chemical. Some stains are of the spirit. For those who still visit, the forest remains unnaturally quiet. No birds sing there, no insects hum. Just the wind whispering through dead branches, carrying a faint echo of something deeper, a low, rhythmic sound, like chanting beneath the soil. Some say if you press your ear to the ground long enough, you can hear it clearly, corpus in spiritum, the body into spirit, a promise or a curse whispered endlessly by the dead who never found their way to heaven. Time is a poor keeper of secrets. No matter how deep the earth buries them, no matter how firmly the living choose to forget, truth has a way of seeping through the cracks like water, like blood, and in the case of Hollow Creek, it was both. Nearly 140 years had passed since the night of the Great Offering. The Ravencroft brothers had become little more than folklore, their names whispered in the same breath as Salem and Sleepy Hollow. The towns nearby grew and changed. Roads were built, farms expanded. The new world marched forward with its machinery and science. But beneath it all, the forest still waited, silent, watching. In 1978, when the construction crews unearthed the mass grave, the discovery did not just disturb the soil, it disturbed something older, something patient. The bones of the congregation were brought to the surface, and with them came the first whispers. Nightmares, strange illnesses, electrical malfunctions at the dig site. Men woke screaming, convinced they'd heard hymns echoing from under their feet. The state's involvement was immediate. The area was cordoned off, classified under anthropological hazard, and a team of specialists from Cornell University was dispatched to investigate. Among them was Professor Daniel Whitlock, a historian known for his obsessive interest in early American sects and heretical cults. To his colleagues, Whitlock was eccentric but brilliant, the kind of man who saw patterns in chaos. To himself, he was merely curious, but curiosity has always been the first step toward damnation. Whitlock's journals, later found in his home after his disappearance, record his first visit to Hollow Creek on July 2, 1978. The silence is unnatural. The air smells of rust and rain. The earth here feels alive, as if breathing beneath my boots. The locals call it cursed, but I suspect something else, a memory still waiting to be told. He began collecting everything: police files, church records, newspaper clippings. The story of the Ravencroft brothers consumed him. The more he read, the more he felt their presence. "They are not gone," he wrote, "they are simply unfinished." Whitlock was the first to publicly question the state's official narrative. He argued that the Hollow Creek discovery was not just an archaeological site, but a theological one, the remains of a sect that had attempted something far greater than ritual murder. He proposed that the Ravencrofts had developed a system of transcendence, a process to separate the soul from the body without death. If true, he said during a 1979 lecture, then Hollow Creek represents the first recorded attempt at spiritual engineering in human history. His claims were ridiculed by academia, but they attracted others: journalists, occult scholars, and inevitably believers. Within a year, Hollow Creek became a forbidden pilgrimage site. People arrived at night, leaving offerings at the forest's edge: candles, coins, locks of hair. Some claimed to hear whispers guiding them deeper. Whitlock, meanwhile, kept digging. In 1980, he obtained permission to re-enter the tunnels beneath the original excavation site. The official report stated that he was joined by 2 graduate students, though only one name was ever released: Eleanor Hayes. The second student remains unaccounted for. What they found inside mirrored Lockwood's account from the 1008. 130s, the carvings, the altars, the smell of iron and rot. But Whitlock claimed there was more. He described discovering a sealed corridor beneath the main chamber. accessible only by removing a slab marked with the sigil of the 3 intersecting lines. Behind it, he wrote, was a chamber unlike the rest. The walls are smoother here, polished. The air is colder, as if preserved. On the far wall is an etching not carved, but burned, depicting a man kneeling before a flame that rises into the shape of a human heart. Beneath it, the words, "Sanguis in lux the blood into light." At the center of that chamber stood a stone basin filled with hardened residue. Tests would later confirm traces of human blood, bone dust, and mercury. Whitlock's notes grow increasingly erratic after that entry. He wrote of voices faint at first, then clear. He began transcribing them, convinced they were fragments of the Ravencroft Brothers' last sermon. One line repeated throughout his pages, "The spirit is not above, it is beneath. The root of the world is its mouth." Colleagues noticed his deterioration. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent nights in his office surrounded by candlelight and the bones brought from the site. He said he was listening, that they were trying to finish their work through him. In February 1981, Whitlock was found unconscious in his study, surrounded by dozens of pages of writing in a language no one could identify. He was hospitalized for exhaustion and removed from the project. But his obsession didn't end there. After his recovery, he began giving private lectures and writing essays under a pseudonym, claiming that the doctrine of suffering had returned in new forms hidden in the rituals of modern spiritual movements, encoded in psychological practices, even in medicine. "We continue their work unknowingly," he wrote. "Every act of pain for progress, every sacrifice for purity, it all echoes the Ravencrofts." Then, in October of 1983, Whitlock vanished. His car was found abandoned near Hollow Creek, doors unlocked, headlights still on. Inside were 2 items, a tape recorder and a single page torn from his notebook. The recording contained 13 minutes of ambient noise, wind, distant dripping, and faintly what sounded like chanting. The page bore one sentence, "It's still breathing." After his disappearance, the state sealed Hollow Creek for the 3rd time. The official explanation cited toxic underground gas exposure, but those who had known Whitlock refused to accept that. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, his assistant, continued to research his notes in secret. She began publishing under the title The Hollow Creek Transmissions, arguing that the site was not haunted but alive. "The forest is a memory," she wrote, "and we are the disease that keeps reopening its wound." In the years that followed, strange incidents began to occur in the nearby towns. Animals found mutilated in ritual patterns. Children speaking in archaic tongues during sleep. A fire in a local church that left the walls blackened with what forensic teams described as organic residue. The same phrase, corpus in spiritum, was found scratched into the altar. By the late 1980s, Hollow Creek was once again the subject of fear and fascination. Conspiracy theorists claimed government cover-ups. Religious groups declared it a gateway to hell, and through it all, the Ravencroft name began to resurface in whispers, in graffiti, in anonymous letters sent to reporters containing symbols identical to those found on the original sigils. One such letter arrived at the office of journalist Margaret Ellison in 1989. It contained only 2 items, a photograph of the Hollow Creek forest taken at night, and a small piece of parchment bearing the words, "The brothers wait beneath." Ellison's investigation would later become the infamous documentary Beneath the Pines that aired once, then pulled from television after half the production crew resigned. Those who saw it still speak of the final frame, a dimly lit tunnel, the sound of something breathing just beyond the microphone's range. By the dawn of the 1990s, Hollow Creek was a scar on the map, a place locals refused to name, where cell signals died and compasses spun. Yet, despite every attempt to bury it, the site continued to draw the curious and the faithful alike. Whitlock's writings resurfaced in underground circles, photocopied, annotated, passed hand to hand. His final essay, The Anatomy of Redemption, reads like a confession. Pain is the only language that speaks in both directions to man and to what lies beyond. I no longer seek to understand the Ravencrofts. I seek to listen. He ends with one final warning. Do not open the ground again. Some truths cannot survive the light. But light, as Hollow Creek has always taught, is not always salvation. Sometimes it is only the reflection of fire. And as autumn winds sweep across upstate New York, the forest stands unchanged, ancient, indifferent, and alive. The moss covers the graves, the roots split the stones, and somewhere beneath it all, something moves. Slowly, patiently, like the turning of a great wheel waiting for its next prayer. For those who know the story, the warning is simple. Do not go looking for the Ravencrofts, because they are still listening. By the turn of the millennium, Hollow Creek had become a ghost story told to frighten children and fascinate thrill seekers. The government fencing had long rusted away, the warning signs half buried under moss and leaves. On most maps, the forest didn't even exist, a blank stretch of green between forgotten roads. But the absence of a place does not erase its memory. Sometimes it only sharpens it. In 2001, a group of graduate students from Binghamton University stumbled upon what remained of the old excavation site while conducting soil studies. They were not historians or believers, just scientists collecting samples. What they uncovered was small but significant. A rusted fragment of iron with the engraved letters E, R, and a leather-bound cover that had fused with the earth. Inside, half-burned pages revealed fragments of scripture no one recognized. The pages were turned over to the university archive, where they caught the attention of a young linguist named Dr. Rebecca Lang. She specialized in dead dialects and cryptic theology. Her fascination with the Hollow Creek myth was purely academic at first. But as she began to transcribe the texts, she realized that the handwriting matched a specimen from the early 19th century already in the Cornell archives, that of Ezekiel Ravencroft. Lang's notes from that period, later seized by the FBI during the Hollow Creek incident. Investigation record a chilling discovery. One page contained a detailed sermon titled The Second Passage. Its central claim, the spirit shall not sleep forever. When the sons of man turn their pain into progress, the soil shall open, and the voice shall rise again. Lang dismissed it as religious metaphor until the patterns began. Over the following months, she reported electrical disturbances in her lab, lights flickering, computer screens flashing lines of Latin text no one had typed. One night, the motion sensors in the archive triggered by themselves. The security footage showed nothing, just the pages of the Ravencroft journal fluttering though the air was still. Then came the voices. Lang's colleagues claimed she began speaking in her sleep, muttering phrases that matched the language found in the Book of Transmutations. She grew withdrawn, working late into the night, sketching strange diagrams of human anatomy intertwined with roots and vines. Her final recorded note before her disappearance read, "It was never about faith. It was about continuation. The forest is not haunted, it's harvesting." She vanished in October 2002. Her office was found undisturbed except for one thing. On her desk lay a single page, written in fresh ink though the pen had dried weeks earlier. It read simply, Sanguis in Lux. After her disappearance, the Hollow Creek file was reopened by federal authorities under the codename Project Seraphim. Officially, the case was listed as unresolved missing person with occult association. Unofficially, it marked the beginning of a pattern that no one in law enforcement dared to admit publicly. Between 2003 and 2008, there were 17 reported disappearances in the surrounding counties. Hikers, campers, and paranormal investigators who entered the forest and never returned. In each case, their vehicles were found abandoned at the same spot, a dirt trail near the remnants of the old chapel foundation. Locals claimed that at night, strange lights could be seen moving through the trees, pale, slow, and rhythmic, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. In 2009, a journalist named Peter Crane host of a small radio show called The Midnight Inquiry, decided to investigate. His show specialized in American mysteries, UFO, cryptids, unsolved murders, and Hollow Creek was perfect bait for his audience. With 2 cameramen and a local guide, he entered the forest on October 13th, the anniversary of the Great Offering. The last radio transmission from his crew aired live that night. We're about a mile in. The GPS keeps looping back. The air feels thick. Wait, do you hear that? It sounds like chanting. God, it's everywhere. Static followed. The broadcast cut off mid-sentence. 3 days later, search teams found the crew's campsite. The equipment was intact, untouched, but there was no sign of the men. Only their cameras remained. Footage recovered from the tapes shows the group moving through the forest under heavy fog. Around midnight, one of the cameramen points his light toward the trees and catches a glimpse of figures standing between them. Dozens of them, pale, unmoving, watching. Then the screen distorts, the camera drops, and the recording ends. Authorities never released the footage. The official statement claimed environmental exposure and disorientation led to the crew's disappearance. But those who reviewed the tapes in private described something else: faces that appeared in the fog, eyes reflecting light where there should have been none, and a whisper that bled into the audio. You've come to finish what was never ended. By 2010, Hollow Creek was off, limits again fenced, patrolled, and monitored. Yet despite all measures, people kept coming. Curiosity is a contagion that spreads faster than any curse. Online forums dedicated to the Hollow Creek phenomenon appeared, collecting old photos, legends, and transcriptions of the Ravencroft writings. Some claimed to have decoded a hidden calendar within the text dates aligning with lunar cycles and historical tragedies. One user, known only as Spirit 13, posted what appeared to be a scanned page from Whitlock's missing notebook. It read, "The vanishing is not an end but a rejoining. The flesh will remember the way. We are the new congregation." Within weeks of that post, Spirit 13 stopped replying. His account's final login was traced to a small cabin 15 miles north of Hollow Creek. When police arrived, the cabin was empty, but the floor was covered in Latin inscriptions carved by hand. On the wall, burned into the wood, were 3 intersecting lines. The media frenzy that followed brought new attention to Hollow Creek, but also new tragedy. Copycat cults emerged across the Northeast, small groups attempting to replicate the ritual. In one case, a self-proclaimed congregation of renewal in Vermont sealed themselves inside an abandoned church basement. When police broke in, they found 12 bodies arranged in a perfect circle. Each forehead bore the words Corpus in Spiritum, carved with surgical precision. By 2015, the Hollow Creek myth had transcended its origins. It had become digital folklore retold in podcasts, adapted into films, discussed in academic journals about mass hysteria. But even as the story spread, so did something else: a sense of unease among those who studied it too closely. Hard drives corrupted, lights flickered during interviews, and files went missing without explanation. One filmmaker claimed his footage of the forest kept changing, new shapes appearing in the background that hadn't been there before. Experts called it paranoia. Skeptics called it coincidence. But those who had seen Hollow Creek in person, who had felt its silence, said otherwise. In 2019, a storm hit upstate New York, uprooting trees and exposing part of the old underground network once again. Amateur explorers posted photos online before authorities could intervene. One image, though grainy, clearly showed the symbol of the Ravencrofts carved into stone, freshly cut, as though done by modern hands. The caption beneath the photo simply read, "It's awake." That post was removed within hours. The account that shared it vanished the same night. Today, the forest still stands untouched and avoided. No official map names it, no guidebook marks it. Yet, for those who know where to look, the signs remain: the sigil carved into the bark of old trees, the faint hum under the soil when you stand still long enough, the feeling that the air itself is listening. Some say the Ravencrofts succeeded, that they transcended flesh and now exist in the roots, in the soil, in the pulse of the land itself. Others believe Hollow Creek was a tragedy of madness, nothing more. But there are those who whisper another theory, that the doctrine of suffering was never meant to end with Ezekiel and Nathaniel, that it was a seed planted in blood, growing quietly through generations, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. And maybe that moment has already come, because every few years someone vanishes. Every few years the soil opens just a little more, and if you walk deep enough into those woods, you might still see a faint light between the trees, not fire, not a lantern, but something older. It flickers softly like a heartbeat, and if you listen very closely beneath the wind and the whispering leaves, you can hear the same words that began it all, centuries ago: the body into spirit, the spirit into light, the light returns. Then the forest grows silent again, as if it too is waiting for the next prayer. They say every place touched by great evil learns to breathe differently. When the snow falls over Ravenwood now, it lands too softly, as if even the wind remembers what was buried beneath it. The land that once swallowed the screams of the faithful has grown a forest of silence, and under that silence lies the rot of memory. No building remains, no stones stand straight, yet sometimes after midnight, when the fog rolls through the trees, a faint bell is heard. It rings just once. Locals who have lived here long enough don't talk about it anymore. They lock their doors, whisper a prayer they don't believe in, and hope that the sound passes by their house like wind skipping a candle flame. In 1911, an excavation team from Albany University returned to map the site where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood. They found new tunnels, smaller, deeper, leading nowhere. In one of them, sealed behind a layer of limestone, they discovered a room perfectly preserved. There were no bodies, no relics, only a wooden chair facing the wall, and carved above it a single sentence: "The flesh must answer for the faith." The investigators logged it, photographed it, and left before sunset. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Henry Vale, never returned to the site. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his study, his notes burned, his desk drawer open, the ledger he had borrowed from the archives missing. To this day, no one knows who took it. Some say it was collectors, men obsessed with forbidden knowledge. Others whisper that one of the Ravencraft brothers escaped the fire, his body never found, his mind twisted enough to keep the work alive in secret circles of zealots and physicians. Every few decades, rumors rise again, stories of small cults performing ascensions in hidden basements, or strange lights moving beneath old cemeteries in upstate New York. Authorities dismiss them, of course. But those who have heard the bell or smelled the faint trace of embalming oils carried by the winter air don't. They say faith never truly dies. It changes its face. And somewhere in the dark, someone is still keeping the ledger, writing names, drawing symbols, waiting for the right time to begin again. When you stand near those woods and feel that slow, cold pull at the base of your neck, don't look back, because belief, once it learns the taste of blood, never lets go.